Hey everybody, in this video I am going to teach you about a process called sighting and angling. So when we are drawing from life, we are taking a three-dimensional object and we are translating it and transforming it into something that's two-dimensional. So basically we are looking at something that has depth to it, and then we need to create the illusion of that depth onto our paper. So this can be kind of a challenge for many people, especially as they're learning how to see like an artist and how to draw like an artist. So we have a tool in our hands, this wonderful pencil, that can be the best, most helpful thing in our arsenal as we learn how to draw things from life. So sighting and angling is basically you're holding your pencil out in front of you, and as you are holding it, you are tilting your pencil to match the angle of the object that you're looking at. So the main thing is to pretend like it is a windshield wiper. So it only goes back and forth. It doesn't go forward or back. So we don't have any depth, right? There's no depth. This is two-dimensional. Okay, so we just have an X and Y axis. We don't have, that Z going into three dimensions. So one way to imagine this is if you are holding your whole arm straight out and your pencil is straight up and down, you can imagine that there is a sheet of glass right in front of you. So you can't push your pencil forward into space. You have to be right up against that glass. And that's having that imaginary wall there is going to help you stay straight up and down. So basically what you're doing is if you close one eye, because if you don't, you'll get double vision and it'll get confusing. You'll close one eye and you're just going to tilt your pencil to line up with the edge of an object that you are drawing. So you are, finding the angle that you see in your object and then translating that angle down onto your paper. So I'm going to get started by drawing this little contraption that I made. It's my playtime tattoo machine. It's always a good time. I used to be a tattoo artist for a brief moment in time. It was very stressful, but also really fun at the same time. So I got a lot of respect for all you tattoo artists out there. Props. It's a hard job. It's an enjoyable job though. So basically the first things that I do is just kind of gauge the angles that my objects are sitting at. And I'm just going to do this very quickly. I'm not going to, aim for detail at this point because it's probably going to change in the proportions. But one thing to note is that when you have angles of things that are going back in space, so those three-dimensional parts, you're really going to want to tilt your pencil this way to angle it. But you shouldn't, because remember, we're going to something two-dimensional. So you need to be very sure that your pencil is staying in that two-dimensional plane. So when I am finding my angles for my object that are going back in space, my pencil wants to go this way, because that's what my brain thinks is going back in space, so it's up, right? But that's not true. You need to break what your brain is saying, because your brain is probably wrong. That's the thing with drawing from life, is that a lot of times our brain thinks one thing and it's totally wrong. Because our brain has this way of simplifying the things that we see and turning them into something that we call schema. So I'm just gonna, write it down. So schema is something that starts to develop in your mind when you're very young. So for example, what's that? You'll all say, oh, it's a person. But, does any person actually look like that? No, they don't. They 100% do not look like that. Nobody looks like that. We would not exist if we looked like that. Or, if I did this, you would all know immediately that that's a house. But houses don't look like that either, right? There are all these things in our mind that tell us, this is a house, this is a person. And we stick with those things because our brain is like, well, that's easy, right? It's easier than trying to comprehend the reality of what's existing in front of us. So our job as artists is to break the schema. We need to ignore what our brain says because our brain is probably wrong. And we just need to come to accept that because, brains are dumb sometimes. And we need to trust our eyes. Our eyes are the truth. Our eyes tell us what we're seeing in front of us and translating that. So we need to basically create a conduit from our eyes to our hand. We need to ignore the brain. The brain is wrong. The brain makes stuff up. So we need to think, what am I actually seeing? What is in front of me? So as I am just planning out these basic angles, another really important tool to think about as I am developing this, in addition to citing my angles, is citing proportions. So remember, proportions are like size ratios between things. So basically, when I am planning this out, I am going to measure different parts and compare it to other parts of the whole. So, for example, how big is this box compared to the length of the pen? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my pencil again, like a ruler. So this time, instead of using angles, I'm going to slide my thumb up and down as like a ruler and measure it. So the main thing is I need to make sure that I'm keeping a consistent distance away from the object. So usually it helps if you extend your arm straight out as far as it will go, if you're able to. And then you're going to just kind of slide your finger up and down to measure things. So in this case, I am measuring the height of the film canisters compared to the marker. And what I'm seeing is that this space is slightly less than the length of the marker right here. So if I measure this, the key thing here, this is not going to be the same size as the actual object, most likely, unless if you're doing like very detailed like drafting, but you just want to keep the same proportion. So when I am measuring, I measure this area and then I move here, and then I know that there's going to be a little bit more afterwards. So it's kind of a, just eyeball it until you get used to it. And then I'm just going to kind of go back and forth with my angling and my proportions. So getting your proportions right is really one of the key aspects of drawing accurately from life. So you want to really understand like the size ratios between things. And another way that you can help discover those size ratios and kind of figure out those spaces is to really consider the negative space. So the positive space would be the object itself, but the negative space would be like the shapes that are created between things. So between my pen and the film canisters, how much space is there? What kind of shape does it create? So I can start looking at those negative spaces in between things. Like the biggest one that I see is the triangle between the pen and the base of the tattoo machine. But we can really like think about the space that's created between anything. So negative space is a really important tool when we are drawing from life, especially if you are drawing or multiple objects. So you want to think about the relationships between those objects as you are drawing them. So one thing that I would like to point out is that as I'm drawing this, I'm not really focusing on a lot of detail at this point. I am really just loosely planning where things go. And that's really important because you need to feel like you can make adjustments. You don't want to get locked into something and then spend, like hours delicately shading and adding all these like really intricate details to things, because it's probably going to change. I used to do that all the time when I was younger. I would like do portraiture and I would just get like so fixated on a certain part of the portrait, and then I would realize it was like not in the right spot. Like one of the eyes is like bigger than the other one or something like that, and I would just get so mad because like I worked so hard on it and then I had to erase it all because it was not in the right spot, and it was so frustrating to me. So learning that lesson of just don't make anything permanent until you know that the object as a whole is exactly how it should be. Another thing to note is to also make sure that you are referencing kind of the angles between objects. So, for example, like between all of these pieces, I've got my angle slightly wrong, so I need to make sure that I adjust that. And I think some of the hardest angles to do are foreshortened angles. So foreshortening is, when an object is very dramatically coming out at you in space. So it's not like at an angle off to the side, but it's like coming straight out at you. Those angles are going to be a lot more exaggerated. So citing those angles is extra important to make sure you get them correct. So as I am drawing the straw piece, I need to really focus on where it sits in relation to other objects, how big it is in relation to other objects. And from there I can start to kind of see the relationship between the different pieces of the object as I'm drawing it, and make adjustments between everything else. So when you're doing things that are foreshortening and you're measuring the angles, you really, really want to make sure you're not going back in that depth. You want to stay two-dimensional, just that X and Y. And when you're doing these foreshortening things too, you really need to fight your brain, because my brain is fighting very hard at the angles that I am trying to create right now. So you need to compare constantly, check back. Now that I start to get these other pieces in place, I can adjust my objects around them accordingly. So again, we're using that negative space. We're seeing where certain things relate to other things. So like the push pin here, how much space is there between the cardboard backing and the push pin? So where does the cardboard backing align with the push pin? That helps me figure out placement of my objects as I am looking at it. And I know that this is a curve, so I'm just going to follow the curve a little bit more. And honestly, now that I am drawing all of this, I realized that this whole back end needs to get scooched up a bit. So what I'm going to do now is really measure the length of the whole piece compared to the height of the whole piece. And I see that this lines up with where the cap of my Sharpie is. So I think before I change any of that, I'm going to figure out how big the cap of the Sharpie is. So I am going to measure the cap of the Sharpie, and then I am going to slide it up to see where it falls on the middle part. And it falls somewhere kind of in the middle of the tape. So now I just need to find the halfway point here. It's fun because the more you do this, the more you can just start eyeballing things and figuring it out. Okay, so this is how big the cap is compared to the rest of the pen. Gonna double check that. Good. All right, so now I'm gonna remeasure to remind myself how wide everything needs to be. All right, so this needs to be here. Actually, that is very close to being correct. I just need to scooch it in just a little bit. I thought it felt a little long. So let's check this one now. I guess I need to add on the back just a little bit. There we go. Oh, not quite. Okay, now I just need to kind of put my angles back in place. And again, that foreshortening is one of the hardest things to do, is to get those angles correctly in place. Okay, so now I can see where my curves are and how they kind of align with this little knobby. There, that feels a lot better. Okay, now I'm going to measure the depth of the machine and find something to compare it to. That's about that big. Okay, so I need to bring this in a lot more. All right, so now what I just measured is the length from here to out here is the length of 3 film canisters. So I'm using my proportions to kind of help me figure out how big my film canisters should be. So I need to divide this into thirds. There we go. Good. All right, so from here I can start to block in the film canisters. This is kind of the space in between them. Always checking your angles. And I notice there is kind of a gap between them. And I am kind of accommodating that gap based off of the lids here. Now when I see this, there needs to be more space between the bottoms and the edge of the cardboard here. Now, as you start to get further along in your drawing, there is one super duper important tip that I have always forgotten as a younger artist, and now that I do this more often, is something that I really rely on. And that is to take a step back and look at your art from a distance. I'd say at least 6 feet, 6 to 10 feet is pretty good. And that is really going to help you see any sort of like structural inconsistencies in your drawing. Maybe your proportions are off or your angles are off. As you begin shading, it's going to really help you see your values better because you're starting to see them just as like shapes of value and not as itty bitty tiny details. And that was something that I really struggled with when I was younger, is that my shading was so light. I had like no value contrast whatsoever. And so stepping back made me really realize that I had no value contrast because I couldn't see anything. It was like so light. So I'd realize, oh, I actually need to have dark values in here for anyone to actually see what I am looking at. So it's a super, super important tool. And if you feel like something isn't looking right as you're drawing, then I would highly encourage you to take a step back. Look at your object from a distance, look at your drawing from a distance, and you're probably going to see a lot more clearly what it is that you need to do. Another thing is if taking a step back was not enough for you, I'd take a break. Just, leave it alone for, half an hour, or, in my case, I need to leave it alone for at least a day, if not more, because I need to come back and look at it with fresh eyes. So I need to kind of forget about it for a little bit, and then I will come back and, start to really just like see it new. It's not something I've been looking at forever anymore. So when I start to see it with those fresh eyes, I can start to notice problems a lot more easily. Another thing that I notice that I have issues with when drawing from life is I'm a sloucher. I slouch horribly bad. My family thinks it's genetic. Everybody in my family's a sloucher. But what I notice is that, I start to like slowly just like bend and bend and bend and bend. And then I realize that I am slouching, and then I sit up straight. And then my entire perspective of the object changes. So, you want to try and be consistent in your posture and in your positioning, because the more you move around, the more the angle that you're looking at changes, and that can really cause some problems when you're trying to draw realistically as well. As you're at these really initial sketching stages where you were blocking out your proportions and your basic structure of your object, so before you get to shading, before you do any of that stuff, it's really important that you're drawing really lightly. That way you can make adjustments. You don't want to have these super dark marks like my schema and everything. I can't erase that because I wrote it down with the point of my pencil, and it, has since been engraved into my paper, so I can't really erase it. So it's really important that you figure out where everything belongs before you start pushing and defining your lines and getting those like heavier, darker values, because if you still need to make changes, you're not going to be able to if you are, indenting your paper with your pencil. So, like I always say, draw it light until you get it right. That might be a long time until you get to that point, and that's totally fine. So just, work on planning lightly, and then you should be okay. So taking a little bit of a break here and looking at this piece, I feel like it's a little squished in the middle, so I need to make it a bit longer. And you know, I wish I would have noticed that earlier because it's a lot of changes. And you know what? That happens when you're drawing from life. Changes. So let's make some changes. Oh, that feels a lot better now. Good. All right. So, like I said earlier, it definitely helps to take a break and come back at it with fresh eyes, because then you can really start to see, you know, disparities between the two things. Because, you know, if you stare at something a little too long, it starts to just get funky looking. So, what I think I'm going to do now is work on values. So now that I kind of have everything in the place where I want, I can start shading and focus on kind of the shape of the values. So a lot of times when I'm working with my shadows, I am also checking my angles, and I'm checking the sort of space between, so that negative space, and looking at the shapes that those things are creating, and that is able to kind of help me as I am developing my shadows and other forms of value as I'm working along. So I don't think I'm going to use a blending stump as I'm shading. I think I'm just going to use my pencil. So that's another thing when I talk about shading. It's important to know how to control your pencil before you even worry about using tools like a blending stump, because I feel like a lot of times a blending stump is kind of a cop-out. It's like the easy way to shade. Granted, it's going to give you like nice smooth values, but I think it's also just as important to know how to control your pencil first. So understanding like pressure and like mark making capabilities of the tool that you are using is really going to help you in the long run as you are developing your technical skill, if you will. So I think I'm going to speed things up and just kind of shade away as we go. So let's get started. Well, there you have it. It's a few hours of work of sighting and angling. Thanks for watching and keep creating.